Hi, Saul here, back again. Welcome back to another show. This week we've got Alex Nichols joining us for a coaching family special, stepping in for Glen Hicks, who's busy with his academy coaching schedule. So this week's show is about small group sessions. Just someone suggested we do a show about this. I thought it'd be a good topic for Alex and I to pick up on, something we both do a lot of. So if you're working with, for example, 2, 3, 4, 5 or 6 players, those along those lines, how to maximise those sessions, the outcomes of those sessions, getting good quality technical, tactical outcomes from that. And if you've got any other suggestions for shows, just please drop me a line. You can drop me a line on socials or email me at saul@mypersonalfootballcoach.com. If you have any ideas for show, any topics you want me to discuss with Alex or Glenn or any other guests, or any suggestions for guests on the show as well. But also don't forget, if you want to find out more about small-sided games, small-sided sessions, ball mastering 1v1, check out my online courses at mypersonalfootballcoach.com. The ball mastering 1v1 and small-sided game courses. Use this code MPFC coach to get 20% off and find out more about small-sided sessions and creating technical players. But without further ado, let's get into the show. So welcome back to another Coaching Family special. Joined by my good friend Alex Nichols. How you doing, Alex?
Yeah, really well, thanks, Saul.
Top drawer, stepping in for Glen tonight. Glen's on academy duty tonight, so couldn't join us, but it's a pleasure to have you out as always, mate. So today I thought we'd talk about small group sessions, something that yourself and myself have got lots of experience in. A lot of coaches might be doing that. So we're talking about a small group of players, whether it's 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 or something like that, and the best way to do that. And obviously you're one of the top of the game in doing that now. You're known for doing that. So yeah, kick us off then. If you've got a small group session, how are you approaching that?
So I think having those type of group sessions with those type of numbers are just good ways to kind of hone in, but still give lots of realistic references. You can start to kind of link on the ball to around the ball, potential positions, and you can link technique into an element of decision making when you've got those kind of numbers. So you can kind of link technical principles into some kind of game insight work, whereby it could be position specific or it could be general in terms of the part of the pitch that you're trying to work on, whether that be build the attack, finish the attack, or even start the attack.
Give some examples of that then. Give some of the technical principles you might work on and give some examples how you link that.
Yeah, so I mean, it depends what you're trying to look at as a coach. I mean, myself and yourself will always kind of put the technique at the core of what we're doing. It depends on the age group of the players you're working with. You work with older players, it will definitely be around their position specific. Work with younger players, it could be kind of principles of the game. If I was looking at, for example, working at right back kind of combinations that they can play to progress the ball forward, could be a case of players start slightly deeper in a central in the middle of the pitch as such, plays out wide to a fullback, could work on a range of receiving and movement types to get on the ball, could be dropping off, could be dropping wider, could be coming in off the line. And then it could be a case of working on specific receiving techniques to open up different passing lines. Could be receiving it late to let it roll beyond their shoulder. We could then play a pass down the line to go and join in and run central. Could be dropping in to get on the ball from your central player, replicate a goalkeeper, to open up and then play a possible reverse pass into like the potential number 8 or 6 or wherever it is. That will be an essential area. So then you're starting to hone down on or hone in, should I say, on technical details such as position that you're receiving in, scanning before you get on the ball, angle of hips, ensuring that you prepared the ball, that receiving touch to open up the potential for a reverse or even the potential for disguise, and then the actual reverse pass technique. So it just kind of gives different kind of references, and you can also get kind of lots of opportunities to rotate players in positions. So it allows for maximum repetition as such.
Quite a lot there. I mean, to talk about, for example, you got a foundation phase group, 8, 9, 10s, for example. Do a lot of those age groups. What gives it like a typical session might look for that? So, for example, you've got 6 players. What might you be doing with 6 players?
Yeah, so for the example I gave would probably be more appropriate for 14, 15, 16 and upwards.
Yeah.
For the foundation phase players, you'd be looking at in a group of 6, maybe looking at along the lines of just the actual reverse pass as such, not necessarily linked to a tactical principle, where it could be a reverse pass into maybe a player that's playing ahead of you. He sets it or she sets it, and then you step in and get a strike off. So then you're getting an element of multiple outcomes. You can work on the ball striking technique, the receiving technique, and also the reverse pass, which is kind of an orthodox kind of type of pass. So then you're working on 3 different technical outcomes within the same practice. And I think that's really good opportunity for players to get lots of goals, but also with multiple outcomes. And then obviously you could tailor it to development needs of your group. If you're working with a group which is of a slightly lower ability, you may limit it, and you could just go reverse the receiving technique and the reverse. Or if you're working with a higher ability group, it could be, like I say, the movement before, the receiving detail, the reversing detail, and also the quality of the ball strike. So you can almost ramp it up and also scale it back depending on the ability of your group.
Do you have like some basic, like, I mean, what are the key principles you're trying to get out in those sorts of sessions?
From a technical perspective, what you're ultimately looking for is first of all the environment. For any detail, you're looking at environment. So the environment has to be set so that the players are, number one, if they work in an unopposed environment, then there has to be the pressure of the speed of their technique as well as the detail. It's an opportunity for you to kind of really refine, kind of like I said, if we're talking about reverse passes, having the ball on the safe side, could be angle of hips, could be direction facing, could be angle of where you're looking before you play the reverse pass. But generally speaking, more widely speaking, if I'm talking about working with six at the foundation phase, I'll be ultimately looking for players to dominate the direction, the distance, and their disguise in everything they do, whether they change direction with it,
Yeah,
or if they're am I reconnecting or
yeah, go on, mate. Yeah, go on.
yeah, so whether that be changing direction with it or whether that be a passing technique.
Yeah, I mean, I thought we said earlier, it's interesting, you said on the ball and around the ball. So FA brought this new 3v3 model out, which I think is really good. So small numbers. So, and then I had a conversation the other day as well on another podcast about, someone said, oh, are we going to be, we're going to be losing some of the tactical elements. And I said, well, no, you can still, within that small sided, you can still get all your, your tactical elements out there. Like you talked about playing out. So I say, in my sessions, I always have the same sort of principle. I do individual ball work, do some 1v1s, 2v2s, I need some 3v3s. And I said, within those 2v2s, those 3v3s, all those where, you talk about in possession, you got height, width, and depth. Can you play in different lines? Can you play over? Can you play around? Can you play through? So all your tactical elements, you can do that in your 3v3s, even then obviously your 2v2s. I mean, so you're not sacrificing. That's what I'm looking for, are you? You're not sacrificing those tactical elements, particularly with the foundation phase. You can still get all those tactical outcomes. And if you're working the defending, you're talking about ball side, goal side, pressure, cover, balance. You can get all those outcomes that you need in the bigger tactical game within that small sided 2v2 and 3v3 elements. Is that right?
Yeah, if anything, all you're doing is heightening players' awareness of it, and they get more repetitions of every aspect of that. Like you say, playing on different lines and working ball side, blind side, moments to drop in, angles to drop in, when to run on the eye line, when to run on the blind side. When you're working in smaller sided, they just get more opportunities and more goals to have it, to apply it. I had a conversation with a client of mine earlier today, and in the US, there's certain parts of the US where they're at 8-year-olds and 9-year-olds are playing 9v9. And I'm just baffled by it, because on so many levels it doesn't work. From from physiological perspective, it doesn't work. In terms of their game insight, in terms of their developing brain and how much they're able to take in, and obviously from the technical repetition, it's almost zilch. So players are going 20 minutes without even touching the ball with any kind of meaning to it. And when they do get on the ball, what they can see in their references are completely gone, because of players don't have the game insight at that age to play on such big pitches and with such a large format.
Yeah, I mean, it's this decision making thing, isn't it? Coach say, "Oh, we need more tactical decision making." We need to see the game as the reality. It's about. I say still get the decision making in that, and also you talk about quality over quantity as well. Sometimes, you know what I mean. Obviously, you're going to get more quantity anyway in those small sided formats. You're going to get lots of repetition, lots of touches of the ball, lots of those decision making in those tighter spaces. But like I say, it's the art of the coach. Do you know what I mean? If you're doing like playing out from the back and do move, like say simple rotations, like I say, playing different lines, height, width, and depth, trying to do all those things you can still get out there, and it's just the skill of the coach, isn't it, to be able to do that. And if you think of yourself as a player, as a young player, what would I rather be doing? Do you know what I mean? Am I rather be doing an 8v8 or a 9v9, or am I rather going to be playing in a 3v3 when I'm always on the ball?
And the other aspect of that, so I think the word and the phrase decision making is often lost on a lot of people. I even ask some of my players sometimes I ask them to often refer to who they perceive to be some of the world's best decision makers. 9 times out of 10, invariably, whether I'm in the US or the UK, players will refer to players as number one, central midfielders, and number two, those who are more often renowned as their 10 out of 10 technical specialism as passing and receiving. And I have to try and explain to them that ultimately the game at every level and at the highest level and at every position is around decisions. And I would challenge anybody to disagree with the fact that 1v1 players actually have the highest amount of decisions to make in the smallest amount of times when they're trying to unbalance and dominate them. Whether that's which way to unbalance, where the larger space is, how to unbalance the player, also what skill you're going to use to eliminate the player, combined with what their decision is going to be in terms of their end product, because they're immediately being chased. So ultimately, decision making is an attribute which is heightened in 1v1 situations because you have such a smaller time frame. We're talking about quarter of a second, half of a second, sometimes less, to execute 2 or 3 decisions that may be made in that moment. And so it almost stems back to the more technically proficient you are, the more it allows the players to look away from the ball and then make the decisions at high speed.
Yeah, I think it's a good point because that's a big misconception, isn't it? It's that, people talk about the unopposed ball work, not related to the game and not decision making. That's absolute rubbish. You got to see, if you try and be a player, when you're trying to manage that ball at high speed with different surfaces of the foot, obviously all game related, linked to the game, there's a lot of decisions going on. Do you know what I mean? In terms of how the ball reacts to my body, my feet, and all the different surfaces and stuff like that. And then again, the 1v1, that's why, like that isolated work so much, particularly with those even all age players, given the repetition they say to get those in those situations. And maybe, look, sometimes it doesn't necessarily, you're going to manufacture something which doesn't exactly like the game, but the decision's going to build into the game after, isn't it? That's the point, isn't it? Those movements, those decisions, being able to understand the skies and shifting and, unbalancing players and doing that. That's why we do it. So I think that's a big misconception around it in terms of, getting that. There's lots of decision making in there. It's really difficult for players to do it. But for me, I always say the same thing. Sometimes it's about quality over quantity, isn't it? So really honing in on that. I want players to be really technically proficient and 1v1 dominant. I'm going to make that a real key part of it. I'm going to give them lots of time to practice that in that isolated environment. Plus your 2v2, your 3v3s, but that's really key, isn't it? Giving them honing down into that. Working on the different, defender in front, behind, side, or you're running beyond or whatever. Lots of different variations, lots of different experiences of that, but loads of I'll talk about lots of high volume. And I'm doing some, consultancy with a Premier League club at the moment. That's what I tell the coaches is that that's what I want. It doesn't necessarily all have to be directional with the ball work, but you've got to have that high volume. Obviously, it's really key to link the ball marches to the game. Obviously, it's all revolved around the 1v1 duel. But if you don't have that volume, and for example, session I did the other night, I noticed that the players, the ability to shift the ball from left to right, the coordination, the relationship between the left and the right wasn't so strong. Just the general coordination and movement and agility of those functional moves just wasn't very good. Wasn't could be better. That's probably a better way to say, isn't it? So that's what I'm talking about. So we have to confront the misconceptions. A lot of it coming from some of the coaching courses, that everything's got to be in this game environment, and understand why and when we're doing things, when and why we're doing things. It's probably a better way to say it, and understand what and the reason for doing it, isn't it? It's about understanding that's the thought process, isn't it? Right?
I also think so. I think people don't understand that when you work at the very top end, regardless of the age group of the player, but when you're working with the top players, I'm talking about top end of top Cat 1 clubs, whether that be U8 or U9 or U16 or older, or even at pro level, those players also have to have these physiological kind of abilities that see them as outliers. Outliers not in terms of the decision making and technicality, but their movement patterns. I say to players, and I actually hadn't said it today in a session, that people talk about physicality in the game. When people say they played a physical team, they were bigger, stronger, faster. I'm trying to explain to them, you turn on, you watch Champions League tonight, you watch the way that Rodrigo works, you watch the way that Vinicius Jr. will move, you watch the way that the top end players move in the Champions League, especially at this stage of the game when you start to talk about Champions League quarters and beyond. It almost becomes about a different game physiologically. Yes, speed still is a bonus. Yes, strength is still a bonus. But ultimately, these players dominate their position with agility. They dominate them with their mobility and their flexibility to play unorthodox passes, execute unorthodox techniques. Those real game changers in the final third, when unpredictability is sometimes players' kind of biggest tool. And also in terms of what you're talking about, environments, or I see a lot of practice where 1v1 is becoming more popular, especially if you're looking online. But the structure that's involved is not appropriate, because players end up doing 1v1s. Great, that's the base of it. But if you want to really be developing players for the long term, if you haven't set an environment for your players, and your session structure isn't right to encourage mass repetition, you're not going to get enough goals in order to build true solid foundations and enough habits.
Yeah, I mean, I say a lot to, like, coaches and players about, it's like physical literacy, in terms of like basic functional movements. It opens the game up. If you've got a bit more balance on both sides, you can go both ways. It opens the game up, for players, and to help with their movement, and it makes, like I said, such a, like repeat myself, but it allows a higher making decisions in those game environments. If I have those movements, I'm more comfortable in it, and then that's the transference you're talking about. That's where the volume comes, isn't it? So those movements, so I can go both ways. I can shift left to right, turn in, cut in, move forward, changing directions with the ball. Do you know what I mean? That high volume, then you see players just to move a bit different, in those little game desires, and then the high volume of the 1v1 that builds in the 2v2, 3v3. So it's just about trying to encourage coaches to give those opportunities. It doesn't, like I said the other night, there's a couple of consultants, that it doesn't necessarily have to be directional sometimes. Because what am I working on here? I'm working on supporting these players and being better movers for a reason, specifically to be better in the 1v1, in those little combat situations, those duel situations. So I'm going to forfeit that game realistic to have that volume, that high repetition quality volume. But then obviously I'm going into those more directional things as well. So it's a balance, isn't it? So you've got to understand, like all coaches, you're picking, aren't you, the best time to do this and do that.
And I also think when you're working towards the top end, at real big clubs, in terms of that, when working with top end talent, you have to almost approach it when you've got already high ability players that are recognized as being really dominant, like you say, in top end Cat 1 clubs, but then also top end in their group, or sometimes the group above. When you're working with that level of top end player, you almost have to flip it on its head. So you have your set principles as a coach, but at the same time, you have to leave enough room for the players to navigate, and also discuss it in terms of perception. Because when you're working with top players, sometimes the way they will perceive things will be completely different, and they'll still get their success. And so we need to keep a window open when you're working with these outliers, if you will. Some of the players that I've coached that are going to play at the highest level will often do things that in an unorthodox way that wouldn't be from the FA playbook as such, or in terms of, or adhere to every single aspect of principles, but they're able to dominate and get to get positive outcome with their own individual processes. And I think as coaches, we have to be comfortable in those grey areas where players may be outside the parameters of what's perceived as common ground or common principles, but actually recognize and embrace these outliers and their perception of what they see. And sometimes you have to start to ask the players, what have you seen in that moment? And sometimes it might be that they got the correct outcome that you wanted, or what they wanted. But being able to understand how they perceive the game is absolutely key when you're working with top players.
Yeah, great point. And I think as well, like, also let's talk about coaching, over coaching, and freedom of play. I think that's, especially working as we come back to, small groups, but you and I, we always get a little bit, distracted by the same word. But let's go back to the small groups, because it's true, isn't it? So like, I think another misconception about this was, it's not necessarily about over coaching the players. So for example, when I was doing the individual stuff at the beginning, I'm trying to challenge players to move effectively, and it might be more commanding. And then obviously when I go into that 1v1 work, there's a lot of freedom there, especially with the small side as well. I say it's all, when working with clubs or parents, I say you want players to make their own decision, and you want them to make their own decision whether they're right or wrong as well. It's about doing it. It's about having lots of free play, lots of openness. And I always say in my session, for example, the 1v1 play, what's the principles? Are we, being direct? Are we trying to get beyond? And of course you can step in and, direct. But I never tell a player, look, you've got to use this skill in a 1v1, all right? We talk about strategies, we talk about tactics. How can I balance? But they have to choose their own locker. That's a big, really important thing to say. And also then when I'm going to the 2v2s and 3v3s, like I say, I have my principles, playing different lines, height, width and depth. Are we stretching the pitch? We're defending, we're making it tight. And then we talk about, again, lots of free play, never try and overcoach it. But when, trying to scaffold, that old Chris Radley talked about a lot of Vygotsky's, theory of the scaffolded learning. Obviously you got to decide when you're going to go in, when you don't, when you give a little bit here, you get a little bit there. Like I say, talked, if, for example, like you mentioned earlier, when to make blindside runs, when to make eye line runs, we kept basic principles, or like we plan on different lines. Are you trying to stretch your pitch? You're checking in, you're checking out. And then, you let them have that freedom to do it. So how do you find that balance in your session between coaching and then letting them play as well?
So I think for me, with the skill combinations, it's principle driven, where I have a set language, about eight or so words, which every player that I've ever coached, especially the last 6-7 years, will be familiar with. They'll hear the words every single session when we're talking about any kind of aspect of technique, whether that be from passing to receiving or 1v1s and dribbling. And when they hear that specific language, what it does is it allows me to be more concise when I'm giving feedback. But then how they then explore that aspect will then be down to them. And when I'm doing my skill combinations, I will break down every finite detail that there is. But then when they go into their 1v1, it's never my job to tell them which skill to use. It is my job to tell them, maybe think about the timing of your technique. If you're going to do X skill, you may start a little bit earlier. If you're going to do a different skill, you may need to start a little bit later to tease the player in. But which skill is your favorite is never mine to tell the player. And I'll never, ever, like, I completely agree with you, it's a huge one, never to tell players what skill to do. Because ultimately, my job is to make sure they can do a multitude of skills, a multitude of movements. Their ABCs, their agility, balance, coordination is outstanding. And then it's down to them to find their way, because they have the technical toolbox. And then it's only about refining, well, why did that not work? How could we improve it? And very often the players know. Especially when you're working in a consistent environment where you see it on a weekly basis, they're able to recognize that starting my skills too late, wasn't scanning as I was unbalancing, and so on and so forth. And then eventually you start to get to a point where that then starts to transfer into their games, whereby they can recognize moments without being prompted, and so on and so forth. But like I say, when it comes to the fully opposed work, you've got to give them a framework, but you can't give them perfect structure, because ultimately the whole 1v1s are about improvisation. We're so fortunate in England now, at the top level. Regardless of what people say about our national team is blessed with so much technical capability and so much technical talent. But it's their ability to improvise which often sees them become the players that they actually are. Number one, was their toolbox is so high, it's so varied, sorry, and their repetition very often. Many of these players that we have now coming through have been through 10 years of the academy system in the EPP environment, whereby not necessarily the coaching's been outstanding, but the program has encouraged more creativity, more futsal type tournaments, more 5v5 type tournaments. And I credit the Premier League for that, to be fair to them.
Yeah, that's a great point, man. I think I was just reflecting recently as well, not recently, but I thought I went to the Southampton United game earlier in the season at St Mary's, and I was watching Rashford play when he was still at United. He was in a team, and how he just get the ball, he just would just used to give it and just run beyond and just use his fit. And I thought I thought from that time I don't do enough of running beyond players in my 1v1, and a lot of player in front, behind, in possession work. And so I thought to my 1v1 work, and then I saw my 2v2, my 3v2s. I do loads of running beyond, in terms of, can I come in short to go long, whatever, like checking in 2 moves, 3 moves, whatever. But I thought instead of my work, there wasn't enough 1v1 running beyond work with the ball. Do you know what I mean? And I thought I spent too much time with individual possession on it, and I say to my players all the time, one of my key principles is forward runs, with or without the ball. You've got to get forward, be exciting, be creative, take risks. And I thought, and I don't know why I'm just going to digress this again, but I thought that, so then I've really tried to include that more in my 1v1 challenges, in terms of, like, I don't necessarily need the ball at my feet, whereas traditionally, whether it's, back to pressure, or, that, one in front or beside anywhere, and doing that. So, but what's your thoughts on that, in terms of, like, trying to really sort of get that global outlook in that individual, that 1v1 outplaying work?
Well, I still feel that that if you look at the world's best over the years, not just currently, they still possess that ability and that danger to running behind. I think if you take Kylian Mbappe at his most dangerous running in behind, when you look at Vinicius Junior, at his most dangerous running behind, players run the risk, and I've seen this happen with pro players. I remember when I was at one of the academies I worked with, and I had the chance to have a very frank conversation with the first team manager, and he was talking about a player, and he said that when this player first came to the club, he said this player ran in behind all the time and mixed up, ran in behind and dropped short. That's why they were so effective. And then as the player's career wore on, players stopped running in behind and everything was defeat. And so it became predictable, became stale, and stopped stretching the pitch. So there was a lack of kind of tactical unpredictability and stretch to the game because this particular player stopped running in behind as much. And so what it does, it makes you predictable to play against, easy to play against, and so entire defensive organisation, if you want to talk about tactical elements, from a tactical perspective defensively, you become so easy and so predictable to play against, which is the exact opposite of what we're trying to do as individual developers.
Yeah, and I thought it was like, yeah, say that, but I also sort of like in relation to the midfielders as well, in terms of like, trying to play almost on the shoulder, on the eye line, and sort of make little movements to go. And I thought as well, the added bonus to that is the passer as well, because obviously there's always a passer. So if I'm doing a 1v1, maybe it's a player trying to play, they've got playing from a pass, there's that communication, isn't it? So when I do my individual 1v1, my one-to-one sessions, I do a lot of that in terms of, open up space to create a line to receive or drive beyond. And I thought, actually interesting, I've need to do more of that. And like I say, not just for the forwards, but also for the midfielders and all, trying to play, trying to create those angles where you can play those clever passes just beyond I can go and receive it, right? And it's like always trying, like Paul Scholes, like trying to play on that shoulder, be intelligent, so I can also play players, I can receive it to feet, or if he gives me the option, I can just nick it behind him. Do you know what I mean? So it's that adds another layer to it, doesn't it? In terms of those clever players, particularly those, those 6, 8, 10s in the middle there, those tight spaces where you're trying to be clever and maybe, outplay your opponent, but that's with a little movement. It might be a run beyond, it might be a little just step back to encourage him and then just nick behind him. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I think ultimately those other players, those certain midfielders that have always been able to run in behind and affect the game and almost run beyond the striker at times. They've always been high value players, right? Especially when we're talking about them at the top level, because the bottom line is the game about scoring goals, stopping goals, and making goals. If you're a centre midfielder, being able to be effective in that final third and entering more entries to the final third you have, providing you've got the technical quality, gives you better opportunity to weigh in with a few goals. And when you do, you become instantly a higher value player to the team and the squad and across several different competitions.
Yeah, but also it's that profile, isn't it? So I was thinking, obviously, you got Bellingham who's going to be that, he's going to make that run, isn't he? Yeah, but then you go like you got like a Modric who's that's more subtle. And what's mean those, I mean, when I say run beyond, it could just be a little couple of steps, but I'm sort of I'm outplaying by just encouraging a player to come in, so I'm going to receive it first touch, and then I'll get beyond it. That makes sense. So it's just that little, I thought that's a little bit, trying to work a bit more on those, those finesses sort of in those tight spaces, but that 1v1, which I do in the 2v2 and your 3v3s, your 4v4s, that comes out anyway. But then there's 1v1 duels, trying to encourage that. Do you know what I mean? So it's not necessarily just me just boom, running 10, 20 yards. It's me sort of just stepping in and then almost taking a couple of steps to get. Does that make sense? To beyond and like that. So that's sort of like, and that two-step profile, isn't it? Sort of like those looking at the moderates, those smaller technical players who are just going to outwit you and just get that and receive that ball beyond you, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think sometimes it's about like them starting on the blind side to then eventually kind of start to drop in on the eye line at the last minute. But then I think that also when players start to run beyond, it can be a case of how they actually interact with the player that they're running beyond. It could be that they start on the blind side and it could be really terrible with the quality of their movements. It could be that they actually engage in touching the actual opposition on the shoulder or spinning them around one way and then dropping in the other shoulder to start to unbalance and kind of disorientate the opposition for sure.
Yeah, I mean, that's for something. I had a small session the other day, 4 players. That was what I had. So I had basically 1v1 in the middle, had 2 resting players almost rotating in. And I started the passing to say, okay, look, because these are under 8, under 9 players, you 8, you 9, good players, and saying, okay, I'm a communicator and I'm trying to support the player into making those like little blindsided movements, and then give it to the player to then you play. Do you know what I mean? And okay, you'll see, a bit of modelling first and then step in, bang, you play, that sort of thing. And it's because you want, because obviously that 1v1, it's also about the quality of pass, isn't it? It's not just about me communicating, like you say, playing balance slide, but I've got to have the quality of the pass so I can get beyond and receive it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I always say this to players, as much as I coach skill combinations, there's actually a lot of work that I do in terms of passing, receiving, and possession type practices, which largely goes unnoticed and doesn't necessarily make it to social media and so on and so forth. But ultimately, the passing receiving aspect of it, if players cannot pass the football and they can't receive it, they have no chance at the highest level. It's just not possible. Passing is the most dominant technical action that there is. So they have to be varied, they have to be concise. And I said to them, 1v1s are risk-taking moments. If you dominate your 1v1 in 7 to 8 times out of 10, you are 1v1 dominant at any and every level. If you were able to do that in the Premier League, you'd be considered a world-class dribbler. 8 out of 10 success rate in terms of 1v1s. With passing and receiving, the demand is much greater. The expectation is that you, on your worst day, I always say to the players that you are 9.5 out of 10. So, and passing forms a huge part of ball mastery. I think people overlook that so often.
And so what do you like he then, a bit of advice then for like, the coach try and put some small group sessions on?
So the big thing is ultimately multiple outcomes. Try and set your session appropriate to the ability of the players. There may be one focus that you have, or it could be a group of players that you work with on a regular basis. If you're working on a regular basis, build up your program and ensure that there's multiple outcomes across a range of different types of ball mastery, from passing to receiving, maybe even area receiving, ball striking, and the ability obviously to change direction with the ball and a little bit of agility work. If you're clever enough with your planning, you can factor in and drip feed in multiple outcomes depending on the development of the group or the appropriate detail depending on the staff of the players.
Yeah, I think for me, that's like, I always say to like, for me, it's about having those principles. So like, I also want tempo, quality, individual ball work. And then I want 1v1s or some 2v2, 3v3s, and I'm big for if you got those numbers. I also say to people about as long as I've got principles, I might work. I'm not necessarily having a theme every week. I set up a 2v2 or 3v3 with maybe a different the setup to get different outcomes. So talk about, I say, always the same principles. You win the ball. Have we got shape, height, width, and depth? Like I say, different lines. Are we trying to get beyond? Are we trying to make those clever runs? So as long as you've got those principles, and then key thing is that free play. If I'm doing a 90-minute session, which I often do, the last 30 minutes I'll just play, that free game. I'm just doing as little talking as possible. Even before that, I'm not doing over coaching, but that's their time just to play, have fun, be themselves, make those decisions, and just have those things. You know what I mean? What's perhaps that's important, that free play and that element there.
Yeah, and I think free play can look like lots of different things. I think you can almost, if you're doing a possession practice or a kind of free game like a 3v3 type practice, it could be that you decide in that part that at no point are you going to talk to the group. You just decide that you're going to put out individuals depending on what you feel they could have done better, or even praised from the positive, and you pull them out. And it might be just be a Q&A one. It doesn't have to be necessarily a command one, but it could be a conversation that you pull out a player just very quickly, 20 seconds, little bit of information, go back in, and then the players who are still playing always get that continuous kind of repetition and get that continuous kind of free play feeling. But there's individual development going on within that. And if your language is set right, you don't even need to coach. You don't need to stop it. It could just be that you reference a certain term or terminology that you have, and then the players can instantly know what it is because your language is that concise.
Yeah, great, mate. And just quickly, I was just this thought come out. So I found this the other day actually when I did a session. I had 4 players, 90-minute session. I thought actually physically the load in terms of like it was maybe because the intensity just a little bit too the level drops, right? Because obviously the intensity you can make it smaller. So actually, what I found doing in my sessions, maybe leaving the last 15 minutes, was actually winding it back and then just going into some shooting technique. Do you know what I mean? So actually change it. Say, look, these players, obviously the quality's dropping, they're fatigued, they're working at such a high intensity now. It's probably more productive for me to work. And I said I just worked on some literally one ball each, in and out shooting movements, and breaking down and working on those shooting movements. I found that quite an effective way just to support the sessions. I thought like the level was dropping because they worked so high. And I actually thought as well, made me think actually sometimes that, do we give them enough opportunities to really work on those like that, the shoot, and then the feedback from the parents like, we love that. We want to do more of that shooting technique in terms of like how to break down the technique. Do you think sometimes I'll ask you that, what do you think about that, breaking that down in terms of, working on the technique, but then also do you find sometimes that you compromise that in terms of when you're working with the groups, when we're working with 1 or 2 players, for example?
If we're being brutally honest, I think for many coaches in the system and outside the academy system, I don't think they know the technical detail. If I'm being honest with you, so I've experienced this at most clubs I've worked at, and I think when there's a lack of technical detail, if you're working with top players, it can be the easiest mask, right? Because if you're working with top players, sometimes you don't even need top details. They're going to do things well. So you just say, well done, do it faster, sharper, quicker. It's the easiest thing in the world. So I think in terms of advice for coaches out there, make sure that you know your detail. Because if you're working with high-end players and you know that higher-end players or academy players or more able players or even in the grassroots system are coming into, you have to have the ability to make them better and to help them. It's absolutely key. And I think also to your point about doing the shooting at the end, I think very often can be overlooked high technique, like just working on technical ability when you've been heavily loaded, and just do you still have the refinement? Do you still have the level of consistency? Can you take the detail and the speed? Okay, the speed may drop down, but do you have that level of consistency to play with when you feel like you're one of your worst, and when the legs are fatigued, when the lungs are fatigued, when the mind starts to wander and you're not as necessarily focused. And what it does, you're ultimately not just building technical habits, you're building mental habits as well to keep that level of engagement. And it could be as simple as, on top of your shooting practice, an element of competition. So it keeps it lively and it keeps them sharp, but they're actually stretching and challenging themselves at the same time.
Yeah, what I found is actually that the level, the intensity of the session had dropped, and so the small-sided game was almost like it was losing the quality of outcome I was looking for. So I dropped it down, and obviously then I did some shooting, and I did the same. Like, you got to hit the back of the net without a bounce to get 1 point competition. So you had a bit of intensity there, but dropping down the intensity and focusing on the shooting, so that it made the outcomes better. The session then better. Then I thought, actually, do these players? I thought myself, if I was working individually with a player, I'd be working with all those techniques all the time, the individual technique, and sometimes maybe they don't get that same when they're working that small group session. I just thought it was interesting. And from this coach on Twitter, the other day, was pulling me there saying, "Oh, you don't." Well, this guy used to work in academy football. He's just extremist, everything in a game. But he said, you shouldn't teach players technique because then you're making the decision for them. But I think it's another big misconception, because I work with Premier League players who struggle with some technical aspects. The assumption is that they're going to solve their own problems. They're going to solve their own but you work with pro players who haven't been able to figure it out. Do you know what I mean? So you do it. So I'm going on another tangent, as I often do. But I've said that's the thing. So I found it really effective, and something right. Actually, within those small group environments, I need to give them the times to work on those technical elements. But then you've got to do it in a way that make sure there's no standing around, no lines, that's things, good tempo. And so there's a challenge there as well, isn't it, in terms of the session design to still get those high intensity tempo outcomes and then focus, for example, on shooting. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. I mean, I had an academy player train with me yesterday, and he said he did a 50-minute 1v1 practice. Had 4 goes in 15 minutes, and meant to be in the academy environment. And listen, I don't necessarily blame the individual coaches. Maybe their level of education isn't there, but it should be there, especially when you're talking about being in the system. And going back to what you said, so this is such a massive issue, that people think that if players just play the game long enough, they'll just get there. It doesn't happen. It's not the way it works. It is the complete opposite of, you cannot gamify every aspect of football. There's certain elements which need high repetition. There's certain elements that need an opposed practice. There's certain elements that need to be built into a semi-opposed practice, followed by a fully opposed practice. And it needs to be built up. It needs to be layered. It needs to have appropriate detail. And like you say, there's players in the Premier League that don't have everything kind of wrapped up in terms of their technique. And at that level, they're still open to learning when they're 23, 24, 25, because actually they're trying to prolong their career and ultimately be the best within their field. This idea of the game being the teacher is one of the biggest problems and the worst ideas that there is in development football well, not just in this country, but that exists, because it's just not true.
That's obviously in England and America, really, it's driving the coach education program, isn't it? I think it's just about balance. I say, I love game practices, but like I say, you've got to know when and where to dip in, dip out. Listen, now let's go. We could talk all night about this, because we often do, mate. So let's get back to it and tell everyone what you're doing. We're up to at the moment, because I know you've got some amazing stuff going on, American stuff, and tell us about that.
Yes. Lots of busy stuff going on. Dallas or Charlotte camp for the summer. Fully booked, 2 weeks in Charlotte from the 24th of June.
You're fully booked. What's going on, mate?
Fully booked, yeah.
2
2 weeks. 2 weeks.
100 players. 100 players.
100 players. So I'm looking forward to seeing everyone out there. Dallas camp, which has only recently been announced within the last week. 10 spaces remaining for that. Still sessions going on in London Sunday and Mondays, and online one-to-ones completely sold out at the moment. But online group sessions available every Sunday, 7 p.m. BST. So people are welcome to join me on that. So yeah, busy, but lots and lots of development going on.
Absolutely top drawer, mate. Thanks for joining us again, mate. See you very soon.
Take care.